Today we're diving into the story of Inaros, a name that appears across Egyptian, Persian, Greek, and Aramaic sources, and, centuries later, in Egyptian epic literature. But there wasn't necessarily just one Inaros. To understand who we're dealing with, we need to start with the most historically secure one, the Libyan leader who led a major Egyptian revolt against Persia in the 5th century BCE. The rebellion lasted 6 years and began around 464 or 463 BCE, shortly after the death of Xerxes and the accession of Artaxerxes I. But Egypt's resistance to Persian rule had much deeper roots, stretching back to Cambyses' conquest of the country in 525 BCE. So, how do we even know all this? Our understanding relies mainly on 4 Greek historians: Herodotus, Thucydides, Diodorus Siculus, and Ctesias. Before we get into the revolt itself, it's worth taking a moment to introduce that last one, since he's probably the least familiar. Ctesias was born in the 5th century BCE in Cnidus, a city in what's now southwestern Turkey. The Persians conquered his homeland. Way before his birth, he ended up working for them, serving as physician to the great king himself and tagging along with the royal court. He wrote several works, most notably the Persica and the Indica. Most of these have been lost, but big chunks survive thanks to later authors. For the events we're covering here, Ctesias' account survives mainly through the Bibliotheca, written by the Byzantine scholar Photius. Now that we've got the background and the sources sorted out, let's turn to what set this whole revolt in motion. Picture the scene: a brand new king on the throne and Egypt already simmering with discontent. And as if that weren't enough, Artaxerxes I had another fire to put out right around the same time. According to Ctesias, just before Inaros' rebellion broke out, the newly crowned king was busy dealing with a revolt of his own, way out in the province of Bactria, led by its own satrap. This turmoil inside the Persian Empire, on top of Xerxes' recent death, turned out to be the perfect spark. Diodorus Siculus tells us these events gave the Egyptians the confidence to rise up again and crown Inaros as their king. Thucydides, though, tells it a bit differently. He says it was Inaros himself who kicked off the rebellion across all of Egypt, both upper and lower, launching his campaign from the city of Marea. Ctesias, meanwhile, describes the rebellion as being led by Inaros the Libyan together with another, unnamed Egyptian leader. Who exactly was this second Egyptian leader? That's still up for debate. Some scholars think it could be Amyrtaios, a name that pops up elsewhere in history as a prominent Persian fighter in his own right. That theory rests on a few clues we'll dig into later. Around 463 to 462 BCE, Inaros realized he needed some serious backup, so he sent word to the Athenians asking them to join his fight against the Persians. The Athenians, who had every reason to hate the Persians too, said yes. But here's where things get interesting. Just how many ships showed up and how much of a difference the Athenians actually made depends entirely on which ancient writer you ask. Thucydides, for one, tends to downplay the Athenian contribution. He says 200 Athenian ships originally headed off on an expedition against Cyprus simply got redirected to the mouths of the Nile. When they arrived, they found that Inaros' forces already controlled almost all of Egypt, except for the White Castle, where Persian and Median troops were holed up under siege. Diodorus Siculus, on the other hand, sees things very differently. To him, those 200 Athenian ships were absolutely essential to winning the war against the Persians. He tells us the combined Libyan and Egyptian armies actually waited for their Athenian allies to arrive before engaging the enemy, who were then besieged in the White Fortress, same as in Thucydides' version. Worth keeping in mind though, Diodorus is known elsewhere for leaning pretty heavily pro-Athenian, so take this account with a grain of salt. Ctesias, meanwhile, throws in a few juicy details that other historians skip entirely. On the Athenian side, he says they sent 40 ships, commanded by the admiral Charidemetes. And this guy delivered. He won a decisive naval victory, defeating 50 Persian ships, capturing 20 of them and sinking the other 30. Ctesias also gives us another detail nobody else mentions: clashes with the Persians before the siege of Memphis, aka the White Fort. According to him, Artaxerxes originally wanted to lead the campaign himself, but his advisors talked him out of it. Instead, he sent Achaemenides, or really Achaemenes, his own uncle and the satrap of Egypt. Achaemenes marched in with a massive army of 400,000 infantry and 80 ships. That count includes the 50 ships Charadamides would later defeat. Things ended badly for him. Inaros killed him personally and shipped his body back to his nephew Artaxerxes. Herodotus mentions this too, and it's thanks to him that we know this decisive battle happened at Papremis. It's worth pointing out that Ctesias never mentions the Persians being besieged in Memphis at all. Around 462 to 461 BCE, after this crushing defeat in Egypt, Artaxerxes tried a different approach, according to both Thucydides and Diodorus: diplomacy. He sent his general Megabazus, loaded up with cash, to try to talk the Lacedaemonians, better known as the Spartans, into allying with Persia and attacking Athens, forcing the Athenians to pull out of Egypt. It didn't work. The Persians just ended up losing a lot of money for nothing, according to Thucydides. While the Persians stayed besieged in the White Fort of Memphis for about a year and a half, they were also busy building a brand new, powerful army to take Egypt back. This new force was placed under the joint command of Artabazus and Megabazus. How big was it? Depends who you ask. Ctesias claims this army had 200,000 infantry and 300 ships, which supposedly joined another 200,000 strong force already in Egypt under Oriscos, bringing the total to over 500,000 troops. Diodorus gives a slightly different figure, estimating more than 300,000 soldiers between cavalry and infantry, plus 300 ships. He adds that the preparations took an entire year, and that before heading into Egypt, the troops rested up along the coasts of Cilicia and Phoenicia, where the Cyprians, Phoenicians, and Cilicians resupplied them with ships and weapons. Eventually, the Persians pushed back into Egypt, and after more than a year of campaigning, they broke the siege of Memphis. According to Ctesias, Megabazus wounded Inaros in the thigh, forcing the Libyan king to flee to the city of Byblos, which lines up with the island of Prosopitis in Thucydides' and Diodorus' versions. With that, all of Egypt fell back under Persian control, and the rebels found themselves besieged on Prosopitis. Both Thucydides and Diodorus agree on how the Persians finally broke the 18-month siege of Prosopitis, with a clever bit of engineering. Since Prosopitis was an island, they drained the canal separating it from the mainland, basically turning it into a peninsula. That left the Athenian ships stranded and useless on dry land. From here, though, the two authors tell very different stories about what happened next. Diodorus says that after this clever move, the Egyptians rushed to cut a deal with the Persians. The Athenians, though, stood their ground on Prosopitis, deliberately burning their own ships so the Persians couldn't use them, and got ready to fight. He goes on to say Artabazus and Megabazus were so impressed by the Athenians' bravery that they offered a truce, letting them return home safely through Cyrene in Libya without losing a single life. While Diodorus might have been playing favorites with Athens, Thucydides seems to give us the more grounded version. He simply says the Persians took Prosopitis by force and only a handful of Athenians survived. Those survivors tried to make it to Cyrene, but only a few managed to actually survive the brutal Libyan desert. Before wrapping up his account, Thucydides throws in one more rebel worth mentioning, Amyrtaios. This guy, he says, escaped capture and went on to rule the marshlands, whose people were famous for their toughness, though Thucydides is clear that Inaros, not Amyrtaios, was the sole author of the rebellion. Herodotus also lists Inaros alongside Amyrtaios as one of Persia's fiercest enemies. Though that alone doesn't prove he's the same unnamed Egyptian companion mentioned earlier, there's even a chance two different Amyrtaios figures existed, both related, both fighting the Persians. Anyway, back to the main story, Thucydides isn't quite done yet. He keeps up his critical take on the Athenian involvement, pointing to a move that cost them dearly. After the siege wrapped up, the Athenians sent 50 more ships, which sailed into the Nile only to get largely wiped out by the surrounding enemy forces, with just a few managing to escape. As for Inaros himself, Thucydides tells us he was eventually betrayed and impaled, though he doesn't go into the details of how it happened. Ctesias, though, gives us a very different ending to the revolt. He says Inaros' forces and the Greeks, around 6,000 of them, fortified themselves in Byblos, a spot Megabazus found impossible to crack. So instead of fighting, Megabazus struck a peace deal with Inaros, promising none of them would be harmed and letting the Greeks head home whenever they wanted. He then appointed Sarsamas as the new satrap of Egypt and headed back to Persia, bringing Inaros and some of the Greeks along to meet King Artaxerxes. The king, though, was furious about the peace deal his general had made. It took a lot of begging and persuading from Megabyzos, but eventually Artaxerxes relented, and Inaros and the Greeks were spared. But Amestris, the mother of Achaemenes, remember Inaros had killed him, wasn't about to let it go. She begged Megabyzos to let her get her revenge, but he kept refusing. So she went straight to the king instead, and after 5 long years, Artaxerxes finally gave in, letting her impale Inaros on 3 stakes and behead 50 of the Greeks. For Megabyzos, this felt like an unforgivable betrayal. He'd given his word to Inaros and the Greeks, promising their safety, and now that promise had been broken behind his back. The general, who once fought a rebel, would end up becoming one himself. He secretly helped the remaining Greeks escape and years later started planning a revolt of his own. Herodotus, in the other hand, gives us a third scenario for the ending. He says power actually passed down to Thaniras, Inaros' own son, and to Pausiris, son of Amirtaeus, both installed as rulers with Persia's blessing. The Greek historians are not our only window onto Inaros. A dedicatory inscription from Samos preserves his own words. In effect, it records an offering made by Inaros, son of Psammetichus, to one Leokritos of Samos, in gratitude for his leadership during the campaign, a rare instance of the rebel speaking for himself, outside the frame of Greek narrative. A second, more debated piece of evidence comes from inside the Persian Empire itself, the Zvenigorodsky seal, datable to the 5th to 4th centuries BCE, whose royal iconography has been read in several conflicting ways. Richard Arthur Martin proposes one such reading, identifying the scene as Artaxerxes slaying Inaros the Libyan, flanked by 4 figures he takes to be the Greek generals who had fought at Inaros' side. It's worth pausing here to ask who exactly this Inaros was. The sources tell us he was the son of a man named Psammetichus and the father of Thaniras. That father is a shadowy figure. Some scholars think he might be a ruler known as Psammetichus IV, who possibly was a local ruler in the 470s BCE. But the evidence for that is thin, so take it as an educated guess rather than a settled fact. A telling detail comes from Thucydides, who locate the launch of Inaros' revolt at Marea, a coastal garrison founded 2 centuries earlier by Psammetichus I, no relation to Inaros' father, specifically to hold back the western Libyans, then pressing into the western delta. This detail can support the Greek historians' claim that Inaros' roots lay in Libya. Evidence from further south deepens at Libyan thread. An ostracon from Ain Manawir in the Dakhla oasis records what is ostensibly a mundane transaction over water rights, but it is dated to the 2nd year of Inaros, and the title attached to his name has become the crux of a scholarly disagreement. Read one way, the text calls him Inaros, chief of the rebels, which would seem to confirm his standing as an insurgent leader. Read another way, it names him Inaros, chief of the Bacalese. The Bacalese being a Libyan tribe of Cyrenaica, attested in Herodotus and elsewhere. If the second reading holds, it raises an intriguing possibility, that Inaros' lineage runs back to the very Libyan groups who had clashed with Psammetichus the first 2 centuries before. Some scholars push the uncertainty further still, questioning whether the ostracon even refers to the same man. Quack, for instance, argues it instead points to a distinct, earlier Inaros, one remembered in Egyptian tradition for leading resistance against the Assyrians. Here the picture genuinely fractures. More than one Inaros is attested across Egyptian history, and telling them apart demands careful cross-reading of archaeological and literary evidence alike, where the Inaros of the Persian Wars comes down to us through relatively detailed historical narrative. This earlier, Assyrian-era Inaros survives only in fragments and later literary echoes, a far harder figure to reconstruct. He belongs to the 7th century BCE, a turbulent period in which Egypt, under the 25th dynasty, was locked in prolonged conflict with the Neo-Assyrian Empire. On his identity, the scholar Kim Ryholt makes a fairly confident case, drawing partly on the cycle of Inaros, the literary tradition we'll get to in a moment. According to Ryholt, this earlier Inaros was the son of Balkanif, prince and ruler of Athribis, who was himself the son of a man named Ptess of Athribis. The Libyan connection recurs here too. Ptahs of Athribis is recorded as a chief of Ma, a title borne by several Libyan princes of the 22nd dynasty, which would make this Inaros, like his Persian-era namesake, a man of Libyan descent. The earliest trace of this figure comes from outside the Demotic epic tradition, an Aramaic inscription from the burial cave at Sheikh Fadl, dated to the first half of the 5th century BCE, where his name appears as Yenharu. That matters a lot because his name also shows up independently in Assyrian administrative records, Niherau HaThiribi, confirming his position as Prince of Athribis. Between these two separate sources, we can say this Inaros was a real historical figure, not just a legend invented later for the sake of a good story. All of this, multiple men, one name, centuries of retelling, eventually crystallized into a literary tradition of its own, the cycle of Inaros, formerly known as the cycle of Petubastis, a body of demotic narrative surviving from the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. Composed centuries after the events they claim to describe, these stories don't merely cast Inaros as a rebel, they elevate him into Egypt's foremost national hero. The cycle comprises the Inaros epic, set in the reign of Nesho, follows the living Inaros and his allies, Nesho and Pikrur, against the Assyrians. The main surviving fragments include a letter, probably a military challenge, from Esarhaddon to Inaros, a duel at the Red Sea between Inaros and an Assyrian sorceress who shapeshifts into a griffin, and a sneaky visit by the hero Pikrur to Esarhaddon's sleeping quarters. The struggle for the armor of Inaros follows Inaros' family and allies right after his death and burial, especially their attempt to get back his armor, which had been seized by the ruler of Mendes. The struggle for the prebend of Amun doesn't have much to do with Inaros himself. It's really about a dispute over a priestly endowment between Anch-Hor, son of Petubastis, and his opponents, the first prophet of Amun in Thebes and the high priest of Horus in Buto. It does, though, feature two of Inaros' sons, Pami and Miname, along with Pedicons, son of Pikrur, Inaros' old ally, who end up fighting on Anch-Hor's side to back his claim to the endowment. The Egyptians and the Amazons tells the story of Pedicons, son of Pikrur, and his campaign into Asia, where the Egyptians team up with the Assyrians against an army of women. Pedicons falls for the Amazonian Queen Serpot, and the dead Inaros even makes an appearance to him. In fact, throughout the stories set after his death, Inaros is often called King Osiris Inaros and given offerings. These stories were written at a time when Egypt hadn't been ruled by native kings in a long time, and that's exactly the point. They worked as a kind of resistance literature, a way of keeping the memory of past greatness alive and quietly fueling the hope for independence. At the end of the day, Inaros turns out to be more than just one man's name. It's a legacy passed down and reused across centuries, worn by more than one rebel who dared to stand up to an empire. Whether it's the Assyrian-era hero, the Persian-era rebel king, or the legendary figures celebrated in demotic epic centuries later, each Inaros became the kind of figure people cling to when the world feels like it's falling apart. Part warrior, part legend, proof that even when empires crumble, the idea of resistance always finds a voice.